10 Controversial Facts About the Moon and Americans Stay on It. In 1969, American astronautics experienced its greatest triumph. Man first set foot on the surface of another celestial body. But despite the deafening PR for the landing of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon, the Americans did not achieve the global goal. The patriots, of course, could be proud of the remarkable achievement, but the Soviet Union had, ever since Yuri Gagarin's flight, secured its space primacy, and even the moon landing could not shake it. Moreover, a few years after the lunar epoch, in the US themselves began to talk about the fact that for the sake of dubious credibility, the country's authorities have gone for an unprecedented fraud. They faked a mission to the moon. Half a century later, the question of whether the Americans were on the moon is still debatable. Briefly, the chronology of the American lunar program is as follows. In 1961, President Kennedy presented the Apollo program to Congress, which required Americans to land on the moon by 1970. The development of the program went on with great difficulties and numerous accidents. In January 1967, in preparation for the first manned launch, 3 astronauts burned up in the Apollo 1 spacecraft right on the launch pad. Then the accidents magically stopped, and on July 20, 1969, Apollo 11 crew commander Neil Armstrong set foot on the surface of the Earth's only satellite. Subsequently, the Americans made several more successful missions to the moon. During them, 12 astronauts collected almost 400 kilograms of lunar soil, as well as drove the rover car, played golf, jumped and ran. In 1973, the U.S. space agency NASA came to its senses and calculated the costs. It turned out that instead of the $9 billion stated by Kennedy, $25 billion had already been spent, with no new scientific value to the expeditions. The program was cancelled, 3 planned flights were cancelled, and since then no Americans have gone beyond the Earth orbit into space. There were so many inconsistencies in the history of the Apollo missions that not only freaks, but also serious people began to wonder about them. Then came the explosive development of electronics, which allowed thousands of enthusiasts to analyze the materials provided by NASA. Professional photographers began analyzing photographs, filmmakers peered into video footage, and propulsion specialists analyzed rocket performance. And the co-official version began to noticeably crack at the seams. One day the lunar soil given to foreign researchers turned out to be petrified earth wood. Or the original recording of the lunar landing will disappear washed away because NASA did not have enough film. Such contradictions accumulated, involving more and more skeptics in the debate. Today, the volume of material from the lunar controversy has become threatening, and the uninitiated risk drowning in the pile. The following is a summary, if possible, of the skeptics' main claims to NASA, and what answers they have, if any. 1. In October 1961, the Saturn rocket is launched into the sky for the first time. After 15 minutes of flight, the rocket ceases to exist by exploding. The next time the record was repeated only a year and a half later, other rockets exploded earlier. Less than a year later, the Saturn, judging by the statement of Kennedy, who was assassinated in Dallas just the next day, successfully threw some 2-ton bollard into space. Then the series of failures continued. Its apotheosis was the deaths of Virgil Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee right on the launch pad. And then, instead of investigating the causes of the tragedies, NASA decides to fly to the moon. This is followed by a flight around the Earth, a flight around the moon, a flight around the moon with a simulated landing, and finally, Neil Armstrong informs everyone about the small and big step. Then the lunar tourism begins, slightly diluted by the Apollo 13 accident. All in all, it turns out that NASA needed an average of 6 to 10 launches to successfully circumnavigate the Earth. And the moon was flown almost error-free, 1 failed flight out of 10. Such statistics seem at least strange to anyone who deals with even the most complex systems that involve humans. The accumulated statistics of space flights allow us to calculate the probability of a successful lunar mission in numbers. An Apollo mission to the moon and back can easily be broken down into 22 phases from launch to rendezvous. The probability of successful completion of each phase is then estimated. It is quite high, ranging from 0.85 to 0.99. Only complex maneuvers like the acceleration from Earth orbit and rendezvous are sagging. Their probability is estimated at 0.6. Multiplying these figures, we get a value of 0.050784, i.e. the probability of one successful flight barely exceeds 5%. 2. For many critics of the U.S. lunar program, skepticism began with the famous shots of the American flag either pulsating as a result of damped vibrations, or trembling because of the nylon strip sewn into it, or simply fluttering in the wind that does not exist on the moon. The more material was subjected to serious critical analysis, the more contradictory images and videos surfaced. It seems that the feather and the hammer in free fall were falling at different speeds, which should not be on the moon, and stars are not visible in the lunar photos. NASA specialists themselves added fuel to the fire. If the agency had limited itself to the publication of materials without detailed comments, the skeptics would have been left to their own devices. All the analysis of the flight paths of stones from under the wheels of the rover and the height of astronauts' jumps would have been left in their internal kitchen. But NASA representatives first told us that they were publishing the original raw material. Then, with a look of outraged innocence, they admitted that something was retouched, tinted, pasted and edited because the viewer needs a clear picture, and the then equipment was far from perfect, and the means of communication could fail. And then it turned out that a lot of things were filmed in pavilions on Earth, under the guidance of serious specialists, photographers, and representatives of the film industry. On the surface, it looks as if NASA is gradually retreating under pressure from the evidence, although this may only be a seeming impression. The admission of the handling of the photos and videos to skeptics actually meant an admission that all the material was faked. 3. The already mentioned Saturn rocket, or more precisely, its Saturn V version with the F-1 engine, did not have a single test launch before its first flight to the moon, and after the last Apollo mission the two remaining rockets were sent to museums. In terms of claimed performance, both the rocket and the engine are still unique creations of human hands. Now the Americans are launching their heavy rockets, equipping them with RD-180 engines purchased from Russia. Werner von Braun, chief designer of the Saturn rocket, was fired from NASA in 1970, virtually during his triumph, after 11 successful launches of his brainchild in a row. Along with him, hundreds of scientists, engineers and designers were expelled from the agency. And Saturn V, after 13 successful flights, was sent to the dustbin of history. The rocket, as they say, had nothing to carry into space. Its lifting capacity was too high, up to 140 tons. At the same time, one of the main problems in creating the International Space Station was the weight of its components. It makes maximum 20 tons, so much modern rockets lift. That's why the ISS is assembled in parts, like a construction set. With the current weight of the ISS of 53 tons, docking assemblies account for almost 10 tons. And Saturn V, theoretically, could orbit a monoblock weighing two present-day ISS without any docking assemblies. All technical documentation on the gigantic, 110 meters long, rocket has been preserved, but the Americans either do not want to or cannot resume its operation. Or perhaps in reality was used much less powerful rocket, not capable of delivering to orbit the lunar module with a reserve of fuel. For Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter by 2009, NASA was ripe for a return to the moon. Skeptics, of course, say that space technology in other countries had advanced to the point where the risk of exposing the moon scam had become too great. The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, LRO, was launched as part of the program to return to the moon. This scientific station hosts a set of instruments for remote study of our natural satellite from a lunar orbit. But the main instrument on LRO was a set of 3 cameras, called LROC. This complex took a lot of pictures of the lunar surface. It also photographed the landing sites of the Apollo and the stations sent by other countries. The result was ambiguous. The photographs taken from a height of 21 kilometers show that there is something on the lunar surface, and this something indeed looks quite unnatural against the background. NASA has repeatedly emphasized that the satellite was lowered to a height of 21 kilometers to take the clearest pictures possible. If you look at them with a certain amount of imagination, you can see the lunar modules and chains of footprints and much more. Of course, the pictures are not clear, but they had to be compressed with a loss of quality in order to transmit them to Earth, and the height and speed are quite high. The pictures look pretty impressive. But compared to other pictures taken from space, they look like amateur tricks. 4 years earlier, Mars was photographed with the high-rise camera from an altitude of 300 kilometers. Mars has some sort of atmosphere that distorts the image, but the pictures taken by high-rise are much sharper. And without flying to Mars, any user of services like Google Maps or Google Earth will confirm that the satellite images of the Earth can clearly see and identify objects much smaller than the lunar module. 5. Van Allen's radiation belts Damashqa did? Yes, 48.33% no, 28.34% no, and I am not going to 15.11% nothing, 8.22% voted, 85,303, as is known. The inhabitants of Earth are protected from destructive cosmic radiation by a magnetosphere that throws radiation back into space. But during the spaceflight, the astronauts were left without its protection and were to receive serious doses of radiation, if not to die. However, several factors speak in favor of the fact that a flight through the radiation belts is possible. The metal walls are pretty good at protecting against space radiation. The Apollo was assembled from alloys with a shielding capacity equivalent to 3 centimeters of aluminum. This greatly reduced the radiation load. In addition, the flight was fast and through not the most powerful areas of radiation fields. 6 times the astronauts were lucky during their flights there were no serious flares on the sun that multiply the radiation hazard. Therefore, the astronauts did not receive critical doses of radiation. Although the increased mortality rate from cardiovascular diseases typical of radiation sickness among those who have been on the moon has been established objectively. 6. The life support systems of the astronauts on the lunar expeditions consisted of a 5-layer water-cooled suit, a tank with oxygen, 2 tanks with water for ejection and cooling, a carbon dioxide neutralizer, a system of sensors, and a battery to power radio equipment. The suit was used to communicate with the Earth. In addition, there was a valve in the upper part of the suit to bleed off excess water. It is this valve, along with the zipper, that is the link burying the whole chain. Under vacuum and ultra-low temperatures, such a valve would inevitably freeze. This phenomenon is well known to the old mountain climbers. They conquered the highest peaks of the planet with oxygen cylinders, the valves of which very often froze, although the pressure difference was relatively small, and the temperature rarely fell below -40 degrees. In space, the valve would have frozen already after the first blow-through, depriving the space suit of its airtightness with the corresponding consequences for its contents. The zipper that runs from the crotch area across the back does not add to the credibility of the lunar suit either. Nowadays wetsuits are equipped with such zippers. However, in them, first of all, zippers are covered with a powerful fabric valve, and secondly, the pressure on the zipper in a wetsuit is directed inside, whereas in a space suit the pressure acts from inside, in the direction of space vacuum. It is unlikely that a rubber zipper can withstand such pressure. 7. Astronaut behavior. The most abstract, unverifiable claim about lunar missions, unverifiable by any measuring instrument. The astronauts, with the exception perhaps of the first expedition, behave like children who, after a long winter spent indoors, are finally let out for a walk outside. They run around, do kangaroo-style jumps, drive around the moon in a car. This behavior could somehow be explained if the astronauts had been flying to the moon for several months, and had had time to get bored with space and fast movements. Equally, the astronauts' playful behavior could explain the marvelous nature of the moon. They were preparing to land on lifeless gray, actually brown, rocks and dust, and after landing they saw green grass, trees and streams. In fact, any lunar picture, even taken in the bright sunlight, screams, "It's dangerous here." The general unfriendly view, the sharp edges and tips of rocks and cliffs, the landscape bounded by the blackness of a starry sky. This kind of environment can hardly encourage grown trained men in considerable military ranks to play in a fresh vacuum. especially when you know that an over-tightened tube can lead to death from overheating, and any damage to the spacesuit can be fatal. But the astronauts act as if in a few seconds the command "cut" is going to sound and the slick director's assistants are going to be handing out coffee to everyone. 8. The return of the Apollo to Earth was a very non-trivial task. In the 1960s, the return of spacecraft even from Earth orbit, where the velocity was about 7.9 kilometers per second, was a huge problem. Soviet cosmonauts constantly landed, as reported in the press, in a given area. Except that the area of this area could be thousands of square kilometers. Anyway, the descent vehicles were often lost, and Alexei Leonov, one of the most active, by the way, supporters of the lunar program, and Pavel Belayev almost froze to death in the taiga, landing at a point not calculated. The Americans returned from the moon at a speed of 11.2 kilometers per second. At the same time, they did not make an impending loop around the Earth, and immediately went to land. And clearly fell into an atmospheric window of about 5 times 3 kilometers in diameter. One skeptic compared such precision with jumping from the window of a moving train into the window of a train moving in the opposite direction. That said, the Apollo capsule is much smaller than the descent vehicles of the Soviet ships, even though those entered the atmosphere at 1.5 times the speed. 8. The return of the Apollo to Earth was a very non-trivial task. In the 1960s, the return of spacecraft even from Earth orbit, where the orbital velocity was about 7.9 kilometers per second, was a huge problem. Soviet cosmonauts constantly landed, as reported in the press, in a given area. Except that the area of this area could be thousands of square kilometers. Anyway, the descent vehicles were often lost, and Alexei Leonov, one of the most active, by the way, supporters of the lunar program, and Pavel Belayev almost froze to death in the taiga, landing at a point not calculated. The Americans returned from the moon at a speed of 11.2 kilometers per second. At the same time, they did not make an impending loop around the Earth, and immediately went to land. And clearly fell into an atmospheric window of about 5 times 3 kilometers in diameter. One skeptic compared such precision with jumping from the window of a moving train into the window of a train moving in the opposite direction. The appearance of the Apollo capsule on descent is much smaller than that of the Soviet descent vehicles, although those entered the atmosphere at 1.5 times the speed. 9. Absence of stars as evidence of preparation of falsification. Talks about not seeing any photos from the surface of the moon are as old as lunar conspiracy theory. They are usually parried by the fact that the photos on the moon were taken in bright sunlight. The sunlit surface of the moon created an excess of illumination, so the stars didn't show up in any of the pictures. However, the astronauts took more than 5,000 photos on the moon, but never took a shot that had the surface of the moon lit up and stars in the picture. Moreover, it is difficult to assume that, on an expedition to another celestial body, the astronauts were not instructed to take pictures of the starry sky. After all, such photographs would have been a tremendous scientific resource for astronomy. Even in the era of the great geographic discoveries on Earth, every expedition included an astronomer who first sketched the starry sky when discovering new lands. And here the skeptics got a full-fledged reason to doubt it was impossible to recreate the real lunar starry sky, so there are no pictures. 10. Cooling the lunar module. In recent expeditions, the astronauts left the lunar module for several hours, de-energizing it. On their return, they allegedly turned on the cooling system, reduced the temperature in the module from 100 degrees to an acceptable temperature, and only then could they take off their spacesuits. This is theoretically acceptable, but neither the cooling circuit nor the power supply for it is described anywhere.